The doors of the church had not yet opened when a stranger's hand closed around Grace Holloway's wrist. She spun around, veil catching against her shoulder, heart already hammering from nerves she had carried all morning. But the nerves of a bride were nothing compared to what came next. An old courier, hunched and breathless, pressed a worn envelope into her palm and said only 4 words before disappearing into the crowd of arriving guests. He told me to wait. Grace stared down at the envelope. No return address, no stamp, just 5 handwritten words across the front, in ink so faded it looked decades old. For Grace. Open before marriage. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. Inside was a single folded page, the paper brittle, the handwriting unmistakably familiar even after all these years. She had memorized that handwriting as a little girl, tracing it on birthday cards and bedtime notes. She would know it anywhere. At the bottom of the page, one signature, Thomas Holloway, her father, dead for 15 years. Grace's knees nearly buckled. She read the first line again, certain she had misunderstood. Your father didn't die in an accident. Do not marry the man standing beside you. The church bells rang in the distance, calling guests to their seats. Somewhere behind her, her bridesmaids were laughing, adjusting flowers, completely unaware that the bride's entire world had just cracked in half. Grace pressed the letter to her chest and forced herself to breathe. What would you do if the person you trusted most warned you from beyond the grave on the one day you could least afford to listen? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Grace folded the letter and slid it into the folds of her dress, her hands still shaking. She had exactly 3 hours before she was supposed to walk down that aisle. 3 hours to decide whether this was some cruel joke, some twisted prank from a jealous ex-student, or a bitter old rival of her father's, or whether it was something far worse, something true. Who would send a letter like this? How could anyone know today was her wedding day unless they had been watching her for weeks? Why would her father, if this really was from him somehow, wait 15 years to say something? And what exactly did he mean by it that the man she loved, the man waiting for her at the altar, was somehow connected to his death? She thought of Ethan. Kind, steady Ethan, who had held her hand through every hard year since they met, who had never once raised his voice at her, who had cried during their engagement toast because he said he never believed he deserved someone like her. It felt impossible, and yet the letter sat against her ribs like a stone. To understand why this single page could shatter her so completely, you have to understand who Grace Holloway was and who her father had been. Grace was 31 years old, a second-grade teacher known for staying late to help struggling readers, known for remembering every student's birthday, known among her friends as the woman who always assumed the best in people, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. She had grown up an only child, raised by a father who worked long hours but never missed a single school recital. Her mother had passed when Grace was only 4, leaving Thomas Holloway to raise his daughter alone, and he had done it with a quiet, fierce devotion that shaped everything Grace became. Thomas had been an investigative journalist, the kind who chased stories other reporters were too afraid to touch. He wrote about corruption in city contracts, about companies that poisoned rivers and paid their way out of consequences, about powerful men who thought their money made them untouchable. He was fearless in a way that sometimes frightened Grace as a little girl, watching him take calls late at night in a hushed, urgent voice. But at home, he was simply her father. He sang her the same lullaby every night. He taught her to ride a bike in the church parking lot on Sunday afternoons. And he told her, over and over, a phrase she carried with her long after his voice had gone quiet forever. Truth has a way of surviving, even when people don't. She was 16 when the call came. A highway accident on a rain-slicked road outside of town. Late at night, no witnesses, no other vehicle involved, according to the official report. Her father's car had gone off an embankment. The investigation closed within a week. Grace remembered almost nothing from that time except the sound of her own crying and the strange, hollow silence of a house that no longer had him in it. Years passed. Grace built a life. She built walls around the grief, the way people do, until eventually those walls became something like peace. And then she met Ethan Ashford. Ethan was everything her father might have wanted for her, or so she believed. Successful, but never arrogant about it. Charming, but never performative. He worked alongside his father in the family's investment firm, one of the most respected names in town, a family whose charitable donations funded the children's wing at the hospital and the new library downtown. Everyone spoke of the Ashfords with a kind of hushed admiration. Grace fell for Ethan slowly, carefully, the way a person falls when they've been burned by loss before, and refused to rush toward anything that might disappear. When Ethan proposed, on a rooftop overlooking the city lights, Grace cried so hard she could barely say yes. It felt, for the first time in 15 years, like the universe was giving something back to her instead of taking something away. And now, 3 hours before she married him, a letter from her dead father was telling her to stop. Grace could not simply ignore it, not after she read further. The letter continued with details no stranger could possibly know. It mentioned the small scar above her left eyebrow, the one she got at 9 years old falling off the porch steps chasing a stray cat. It mentioned the lullaby he used to hum, word for word, the one she still caught herself humming without realizing it. No prankster, no jealous rival, no cruel stranger could have known these things. Only her father, only Thomas. Near the bottom of the page was one final instruction, written in the same careful hand. Go to my old workshop, look beneath the third floorboard. Grace's pulse roared in her ears. The workshop had sat untouched behind her childhood home for 15 years. Locked, forgotten, a place she avoided because it hurt too much to remember him standing at that old workbench. Her wedding dress suddenly felt too tight, the church too loud, the eyes of everyone around her too watchful. She told her bridesmaids she needed air. She told her aunt she needed a moment alone before the ceremony. And then, with her veil still pinned in place and her wedding shoes crunching against gravel, Grace Holloway slipped out a side door and drove, in her wedding dress, to the one place she swore she would never return to. The workshop door groaned open after 15 years of silence. Dust hung thick in the slanted afternoon light. Cobwebs stretched across her father's old tools, still hanging exactly where he'd left them the week before he died. Grace knelt at the workbench, her dress pooling around her on the dirty floor, and pried up the third floorboard with trembling fingers. Underneath was a metal box, rusted at the edges but intact. Inside, she found newspaper clippings her father had saved, personal journals filled with cramped, urgent handwriting, small audio cassette tapes, the kind he used to record interviews, financial documents covered in circled numbers and question marks, and, at the very bottom, a second envelope, sealed, with words that made Grace's breath catch in her throat. If Ethan Ashford ever asks you to marry him, her father had known. Somehow, years before Ethan even existed in her life, Thomas Holloway had prepared for this exact moment. Grace tore open the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a single photograph, yellowed with age. Her father, younger, standing shoulder to shoulder with another man outside a building she didn't recognize. She turned the photo over. On the back, in her father's handwriting, was a date, 3 days before the accident. She flipped it back over and studied the second man's face more closely. Older, silver-haired, unmistakably familiar because she had seen that same face at family dinners for the past 2 years, softened by age but the resemblance undeniable. Richard Ashford, Ethan's father. If you're still watching up to now, type "I'm still here" in the comments section. Grace sat on the dusty floor of her father's workshop in her wedding dress, the photograph trembling in her hands, and felt 15 years of grief and love and trust collapse into a single unbearable question. Had the family she was about to marry into been connected to her father's death the entire time? She forced herself to keep reading. The journals told a story far larger than she had ever imagined. Her father hadn't simply been writing about corruption in the abstract. He had been investigating something specific, something enormous, something involving a name that appeared again and again across page after page of his careful, obsessive handwriting. Richard Ashford. According to Thomas's notes, millions of dollars had vanished from a development fund years earlier, money that should have gone toward affordable housing projects across the county. Instead, it had disappeared into shell companies, offshore accounts, and quiet payoffs. Thomas had tracked the money for months. He had interviewed former employees who spoke on the condition of anonymity. He had documented witnesses who later recanted their statements after receiving unexplained cash deposits. Page after page detailed a slow, patient unraveling of a cover-up so large it reached into every corner of the city's political and financial elite. And then, abruptly, the entry stopped. The final journal page was dated 4 days before the crash. It read simply, "Meeting with R.A. tomorrow. If something happens to me, the truth is in the workshop. Grace must never marry into this family without knowing." Grace's hands went cold. Someone had known she would fall for an Ashford before she ever met one. Or perhaps her father had simply understood, even then, that a family like the Ashfords would remain powerful enough, connected enough, wealthy enough to eventually cross paths with his daughter's life, no matter what. The official police report had ruled her father's death a single vehicle accident. No other car involved, no suspicious circumstances. Case closed within a week, faster than any accident investigation Grace had ever heard of. At the time, 16-year-old Grace had accepted it because grief left no room for questions. Now, 31-year-old Grace understood exactly how convenient that speed had been for anyone who needed the investigation to disappear quietly. She had a choice to make, and the wedding clock was still ticking. She could return to the church, put the letter and the box and the photograph out of her mind, and marry the man she loved in front of 200 guests who had already taken their seats. Or she could cancel everything on the strength of a decades-old suspicion and destroy both families in the process, possibly for nothing. Grace chose a third option. She would walk back into that church, sit beside the man she loved, and search for the truth without anyone knowing, for as long as she possibly could. It did not take long for someone to notice. Within an hour of returning to the church, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She answered out of instinct, and the line went dead the moment she said hello. Then it happened again, and again. By the third missed call, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. She told herself it was nerves. She told herself it was nothing. But when she reached into her overnight bag later that evening to retrieve one of her father's journals, it was gone, not misplaced. Gone, along with two of the audio tapes. As if someone had known exactly what she'd taken and exactly where she kept it. Someone was watching her. Someone knew she had opened that box. Grace barely slept that night. She lay awake beside a sleeping Ethan, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the man breathing peacefully next to her had any idea what his family might have done, or whether he was simply another piece of a story that had been written long before either of them were born. She studied his face in the dim light and searched for any hint of deception. She found only exhaustion and love, and she hated how much that confused her. The next morning, she could not wait any longer. She found Ethan alone in his study, the wedding rescheduled and quietly explained away to guests as a family emergency, and she placed the photograph on the desk between them. "Do you know who this is standing next to my father?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Ethan studied the photo for a long moment, his brow furrowing, confusion spreading across his face in a way that no one could easily fake. "That's my dad," he said slowly. "Why would he be standing with your father? I didn't even know they knew each other." Grace searched his eyes for any flicker of deceit and found none. Only genuine, dawning confusion, followed by something that looked like fear. "Grace, what's going on? Talk to me." She told him everything. The letter, the workshop, the journals, the missing tape, the phone calls that went silent the moment she answered. She watched the color drain from Ethan's face as the story unfolded, watched him sit down hard in his chair as if the weight of it had physically struck him. "My father told me your dad's death was a tragedy," Ethan whispered. "That's all he ever said. He never mentioned knowing him. He never mentioned any of this." Together, they searched the remaining tapes, the ones the intruder hadn't managed to steal, and found one final recording tucked inside a hollowed-out book Thomas had hidden separately from the rest of the evidence, as though he had anticipated that someone might come looking. Ethan's hands shook as he pressed play. Their family's history unraveled in Thomas Holloway's own voice, calm and steady even as he described the danger closing in around him. Richard Ashford, the recording explained, had not caused the accident directly, but he had known who did. He had covered up the truth for 15 years because exposing it would have unraveled everything he'd built. The business empire, the family name, the charitable reputation that had shielded him from scrutiny for decades. Thomas had confronted him days before his death, giving him one final chance to come forward. Richard had refused. Days later, Thomas was dead, and the case was closed before anyone thought to ask the right questions. Thomas's final words on the recording broke something open in Grace's chest. "If you're hearing this, Grace, it means you found someone connected to that family, and I'm sorry the timing worked out this way. I need you to know this isn't about hate. I never wanted to hurt you or stand in the way of your happiness. I only wanted you to walk into your future with your eyes open, choosing it freely instead of inheriting a lie you never knew existed. Whatever you decide, know that I loved you enough to make sure you'd have the chance to choose the truth." Grace wept in a way she hadn't allowed herself to in 15 years. Not from anger, from something closer to relief, the strange relief of finally understanding a grief that had never quite made sense until now. Ethan reached for her hand, his own eyes wet. "I need to talk to my father," he said. "Today." The confrontation happened in the Ashford family study that same afternoon. Grace standing beside Ethan as Richard Ashford's composed, practiced expression cracked for the first time in either of their memories. He did not deny it. He simply sat, silent, for a long moment, before admitting in a low voice that he had buried the truth not because he had harmed Thomas Holloway, but because he had been too afraid of what exposing his silence would cost him. "I told myself I was protecting my family," Richard said quietly. "I convinced myself it was the only choice. I was wrong." Grace felt no satisfaction in the confession, only a quiet, exhausted grief for everything that 15 years of silence had cost. She thought of every birthday her father missed, every milestone he never saw, all because a powerful man had chosen his own comfort over the truth. In the weeks that followed, authorities reopened the case. The evidence Thomas had spent years gathering finally found its way into hands that could act on it. Richard Ashford's carefully built empire began to unravel under the weight of a truth he could no longer contain. Ethan, to Grace's quiet astonishment and deep respect, chose to stand fully on the side of justice rather than family loyalty, cooperating with investigators even as it cost him his relationship with his father. Grace and Ethan did marry eventually, though not on the date they had originally planned. It was a smaller ceremony, quieter, held in the same countryside church, but without the crowds or the spectacle, just the people who mattered most, standing witness to two people who had chosen honesty over comfortable silence. Grace wore her mother's old necklace instead of anything new, and somewhere, tucked into the bouquet she carried down the aisle, was a single folded page in handwriting she would recognize anywhere. Sometimes love does not protect us from painful truths. Sometimes love is the very reason those truths are finally allowed to surface. Grace understood, standing at that altar the second time, what her father had truly been trying to teach her all along. Real love is never built on hidden lies. The strongest foundations are the ones built on truth, no matter how painful that truth may be to uncover. She did not find peace because every part of the mystery had been easy to accept. She found peace because she no longer had to live quietly inside someone else's version of the past. If you were in Grace's position, would you have gone through with the wedding, or trusted a warning from beyond the grave? Would you have chosen the comfort of the life you already knew, or the uncertain, painful weight of the truth? Do you believe the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how many years pass? Share your honest thoughts in the comments below, and let us know how the story made you feel. And if you think this mystery was hard to believe, wait until you hear the story of the family who inherited an old farmhouse, only to discover a hidden room that had been sealed shut for nearly 50 years. Subscribe for more unforgettable stories filled with mystery, emotion, family secrets, and life lessons that stay with you long after the story ends.